Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar on international trade with UK. My name is Leah Cherian. I am responsible for export development at SEDA, and I will be your host for this exciting and informative session. Welcome to our esteemed guests from the UK High Commission, Ashbury Global, and all our South African SMMEs eager to explore trade opportunities with the UK. It is a great pleasure to have you all here today. May I inform that the link for today's webinar and the presentations will be sent to each individual that registered. Next, we would love to hear from you during today's session. If you have a question for our speaker, please feel free to send it through the Q&A box or the chat box at the top of your screen. We will be answering questions at the end of the session. If we don't get to your question during the webinar, we'll be surely following up thereafter. General comments can be made in the chat session too. Today, we gather to discuss a topic of utmost importance for South African SMMEs: international trade with the United Kingdom. The UK remains a crucial partner for our SMMEs, offering lucrative opportunities for growth, expansion, and collaboration across various sectors. The United Kingdom has long been a significant trading partner for South Africa, and for good reason. For South African SMMEs, exporting to the UK means tapping into a market that values quality, innovation, and reliability. It is also a market that can serve as a gateway to further opportunities in Europe and beyond. However, to succeed in this competitive environment, understanding and complying with UK regulations and standards is crucial. Today, we will delve into these important topics and provide you with the knowledge and tools needed to navigate the UK market effectively. Before we delve into the specifics, I would like to introduce the Manager for Program Management at SEDA, Mr. Ambrose Mokwale, to do the welcome. Thank you, sir, and I hand over the platform to you. Mr. Mokwale, you, over to you,
Sorry,
sir.
sorry, I was muted. What's happening here? Okay, thank you, Madam Leah. Good morning, distinguished guests, colleagues, and friends. It is with great pleasure that I welcome you to today's webinar on international trade with the United Kingdom. I extend a warm welcome to our esteemed guests, UK High Commission and Ashbury, who will be sharing valuable insights with us this morning. At SEDA, we recognize the immense importance of fostering strong relationships with key stakeholders like the UK High Commission. Such partnerships are crucial in advancing our mutual goals of promoting trade and economic development. The United Kingdom remains a vital trading partner for us, offering significant opportunities for growth and collaboration. Today's webinar focuses on a critical aspect of trade, quality information on food labeling and requirements for exports into the UK market. This knowledge is essential for our SMMEs and cooperatives participating in the export sector, ensuring compliance and enhancing market access. As we delve into these discussions, let us reaffirm our commitment to facilitating smooth trade relations and equipping our enterprises and SMMEs with the tools they need to thrive internationally. Together, through forums like today's webinar, we strengthen our ties and pave the way for sustainable economic partnership. I wish everyone fruitful deliberations, and I look forward to the insights that will drive our export development efforts forward. Thank you once again to our distinguished guests for joining us today. Thank you, Leah.
Thank you very much, sir. Your words have set a positive tone for today's webinar, and we're excited to delve into the opportunities and knowledge that lie ahead. One of the key aspects of ensuring success in the UK market is compliance with food labeling regulations. Accurate and compliant food labeling is not only a legal requirement, but also a critical component of building consumer trust and ensuring product safety. Proper labeling helps consumer make informed choices and enhances the credibility of our products in the international market. Now, without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce our first speaker, Ms. Natasha Stotesbury, Head of Trade Policy, Southern Africa at the British High Commission in Pretoria. Ms. Stotesbury will enlighten us on the SACU+M agreement and its profound benefits for South African exporters. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you very much for welcoming me today and the warm introductions. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be hosted by SEDA and speak with you all about the benefits from the Economic Partnership Agreement, or EPA, between the Southern African Customs Union, Mozambique, and the UK. Can I just check, please, Leah, whether you can see my slides?
I can, thank you.
Brilliant. So without further ado, what I would like to take you through today is an overview of the Economic Partnership Agreements, the benefits from the SACU UK Economic Partnership Agreement, deep diving in particular into the rules of origin and the accumulation provisions in the treaty, how we can improve the treaty together over time, and then trade support programming supported by the UK government for businesses like yours. I'd like to end by setting out some of the resources and some handy links, which I'll share when the slides are circulated to you all afterwards. And then it'll be brilliant to have your questions and answers when we have time at the end. I'm really looking forward to hearing your feedback. Starting then with a brief overview of the Economic Partnership Agreements. What are they? What is this acronym if you haven't come across it before? The UK has 8 economic partnership agreements with 33 countries across Africa, the Caribbean, and the Pacific. 6 of these economic partnership agreements are in Africa. The EPAs, the economic partnership agreements, are principally development-focused trade agreements that aim to promote increased trade and investment and contribute to sustainable growth and poverty reduction. These treaties offer immediate, permanent, duty-free access to the UK market on virtually all products. This works to support partner countries to grow export sectors, create jobs, develop regional supply chains, stimulate investment, and attract technology. So on your slide, you can see in particular the countries listed there on your right that are part of the SACUM, the Southern African Customs Union and Mozambique, UK Economic Partnership Agreement. This entered into force on the 1st of January 2021, and it provides continuity in the trading relationship between Botswana, Eswatini, Lesotho, Mozambique, Namibia, South Africa, and the UK after the United Kingdom left the European Union. To provide a bit more of a background, this means that the SADC EPA, the Southern African Development Community Economic Partnership Agreement with the EU, was used as a foundation for the Economic Partnership Agreement between SACUM and the UK, including provisions on trade in goods and intellectual property. All of the relevant sections of the SADC EU EPA were reproduced with the necessary technical and administrative changes to ensure operability and an orderly transition from the EU to the UK agreement. And a future work programme for the joint institutions that monitor implementation of the agreement was also agreed. As part of this agreement, the UK committed to providing duty-free, quota-free access to approximately 95% of goods imported from South Africa to the UK. And now that the agreement has successfully entered into force, we're considering, in discussion with our partners, ways in which we can implement the agreement fully and enhance the benefit derived from the agreement over time for businesses like yourselves in Southern Africa. We've held 2 senior trade and development committees since the agreement entered into force, and we hope to hold the ministerial joint council shortly. So hopefully that provides you a nice introduction to what EPAs are, and specifically the UK's agreement with countries including South Africa in the region. Allow me to dive into some detail now on some of the benefits of the EPA that I started outlining in the previous slide. So, to be clear, EPAs are asymmetrical. The idea is that they provide permanent, duty-free, quota-free access to almost all good products. So for other countries in the Southern African Customs Union, Mozambique, it's 100% on all goods products, except arms and ammunition. And for South African goods, 95% of goods enter the UK tariff-free under the Economic Partnership Agreement. And they're asymmetrical in the sense that SACUM countries, so countries in the Southern African Customs Union and Mozambique, can protect more of their most sensitive products from liberalisation. And also the agreement provides generous safeguard provisions. There's gradual tariff liberalisation of goods in SACU. So for example, only 85% of UK exports to SACU get duty-free, quota-free access, and then products covering an approximate further 13% of UK exports benefit from reduced tariffs or tariff-free quotas. I'd like to, over the following few slides, dig in a little bit more to the final 3 bullet points that you see on your slide. The first one being around the generous rules of origin, particularly on accumulation provided by the Economic Partnership Agreement, designed to fulfil the aims that I mentioned on the previous slide around economic development within the Customs Union and in Mozambique. The second area I'd like to delve into a little bit more is the joint institutions that the EPA provides for to facilitate deeper trade relations. At the moment, it's a goods-only agreement, but the text points to the possibility of future negotiations to expand into areas such as procurement, services, investment. And we could also consider if other provisions would be beneficial, for example, on labour or climate. And then the final point, which I'll dive into in the following few slides, is the commitment under the Economic Partnership Agreement for the UK to development cooperation with the Customs Union and Mozambique. So this includes UK support to implementation of the agreement through the appropriate and effective UK funding mechanisms in consultation with partners under the agreement. So not limited to, but for example, development cooperation could include policy development, legislative and regulatory framework development, capacity building and training. And as I say, I'll go on to some more detail in the following slides. I'll kick off, as I said, with talking a little bit more about rules of origin and accumulation. So the UK Economic Partnership Agreements offer generous rules of origin and accumulation provisions. Forgive me if you know all of this already, but rules of origin are laws, regulations, and administrative arrangements that determine the general application used to determine the country of origin of a good. Preferential rules of origin apply when 2 or more countries have a formal trade agreement, like we do between the UK, Southern African Customs Union and Mozambique, to allow for goods to receive preferential treatment, different from the World Trade Organization's most favoured nation principle. So the preferential rules of origin that are set out in our economic agreement basically determine whether and how a good receives the preferential tariff under the Economic Partnership Agreement. And then accumulation is a flexibility provision that permits an exporter to source inputs from a wider defined regional pool of suppliers in order to reach the requisite value add under the product-specific rule to continue to receive the preferential tariff. So in other words, the accumulation provisions allows for companies like yours to consider input materials imported from a third country outside the EPA as originating for the purpose of then exporting to the UK and receiving the preferential tariff. This is provided that the processing is done on the input materials goes beyond insufficient operations. And in other words, the idea is that these accumulation provisions help develop new supply chains by allowing countries to source inputs from foreign countries that are not necessarily produced domestically, and they can then be counted as originating when determining the status of the final good. These provisions can be complex, so very, very happy to follow up with specific questions offline and provide more in-depth presentations. For now, what I did just really want to underline was the bilateral cumulation and the extended cumulation offers in the Economic Partnership Agreement between the UK and the Southern African Customs Union and Mozambique. Bilateral cumulation here means that each party under our EPA can use products originating in the other country without the final good losing its originating status. And it's worth noting a sort of example of this would be, say, a manufacturer in South Africa, one of you on the call, using inputs from the UK in the production of your good here, and then being able to export those goods back to the UK under the preference provided for the EPA, and then just provided that the goods meet the certain criteria set out in the Economic Partnership Agreement. And there'll be some links on the final few slides on where you can find out the detail to check your specific product. The extended cumulation then goes beyond the countries that are part of our EPA. And this allows for the use of inputs from other countries, so countries outside of the Economic Partnership Agreement, and allows businesses like yourselves to consider those third-party inputs as originating within the Customs Union or Mozambique under the Economic Partnership Agreement for them when you, say, export onto the UK to receive the preferential tariff. For example, South African producer using inputs from the European Union in the production of your goods, and then exporting to the UK, counting those inputs as originating in South Africa. So hopefully didn't bore you too much with all of that, but important provisions we hope to help support deeper intra-regional trade and benefiting from the duty-free access to the UK markets. I also just want to take a little bit more time to set out to make sure we were clear on the same proofs of origin being used under the UK SACU EPA, and the sort of important documentation that's required, and the use of specifying the United Kingdom on those EUR1 forms in order to make sure that you do benefit from the preferential tariffs, the zero tariffs on almost all South African goods exports to the UK. Also just wanted to make sure that you had at your fingertips a link to the UK integrated online tariff. The link here you can see before you, and just to outline, for example, how for a specific good, the delicious mandarins, for example, here in South Africa, how you receive a zero duty-free rate when exporting to the UK compared to what the third country duty would be otherwise. In other words, the duty if there was no preferential trade agreement in place. Moving on now, I talked a little bit earlier around one of the benefits from the EPA being that it establishes these institutions, these committees. In other words, we like to think of these treaties as living agreements which we can improve together. And it's one reason why I really enjoy and I'm keen to do more of these type of presentations in order to gather feedback from businesses like yourselves on how the Economic Partnership Agreement is working for you and how we could look to make it better over time. As this slide sets out, we have ministerial level and also senior official level committees set up under the framework of the EPA that seek to agree these improvements over time. And there are 3 areas set out on that slide that we're looking at the moment, including how best to support greater intra-regional trade. The UK government is a very strong supporter of the African Continental Free Trade Area. Secondly, as mentioned earlier in the presentation, investigating opportunities for new provisions on areas beyond goods, given the agreement currently is a goods-only agreement, and then also supporting implementation, so really formalising those generous accumulation opportunities we were talking about earlier and making sure they are being utilised. Now, if you'll allow me, I'll move on to the third area that I talked about, doing a little bit of a deep dive on as one of the benefits from the Economic Partnership Agreement, and that being the development cooperation under the Economic Partnership Agreement. And I won't talk about some of the sort of specific particular areas where we've supported the agreement implementation in order to avoid getting too technical, but happy to talk about that offline. But I wanted to draw attention instead to some of the wider UK supported trade for development programming that in recent years has supported small and medium enterprises and businesses more broadly in South Africa. The first slide here sets out Trade Forward Southern Africa, programme that ran over the last 4 years in South Africa and the wider region, and some of the outcomes from the programming. There's a link on this slide where you can find out further details, and the right shows some of our partners under the programme who we're really pleased to partnership with in order to support, as you can see on this slide, many South African businesses and entrepreneurs through technical assistance and various other trainings. The sectors that were focused on under TFSA, Trade Forward Southern Africa, were aquaculture, fruit, nuts, veg, cosmetics, natural ingredients, green technology and renewable energy. Indeed, I hope some of you on this call felt like you benefited from this programme, and would really welcome hearing your feedback if you haven't already had a chance to share it with us. I also wanted to make sure you were aware that the Trade Forward Southern Africa Trade Hub and the School of Export that were created under the programme have not gone away. We handed over ownership to the International Trade Institute of Southern Africa after the programme closed earlier this year. And it remains an excellent resource, free online, to delve into both information and resources on export readiness, finding buyers, trading prices, standards, compliance. And then, if that's the hub here, hopefully you can see my little laser, then the School of Export, the link of which is here, provides several modules on how to export. So I just wanted to also make sure, if you're not already, that you have these resources at your fingertips, and these are designed specifically for countries in the Southern African Customs Union and Mozambique. I wanted then to also come on to some wider resources that you might find useful when you're looking forward to exporting to the UK market. So we hear some of these questions a lot. Very welcome hearing more feedback today. And we provide a help desk, which I'll go on to more detail on the next few slides, called Growth Gateway, and some leaflets and flyers that I will also share after this presentation. Sorry, they're so small here. They'll be zoomed in on the next slide. But the idea here is we have a dedicated service, Gateway, to promote two-way trade and investment between the UK and countries across Africa, delivering commercial benefits, development impact, and there's a particular focus also on greening trade as well. So you'll find within the Growth Gateway help desk digital guidance pages on export readiness, import regulations, financing offers. And you will also have the option of applying for business advisory support that's tailored one-to-one to your firm, depending on if it meets certain criteria, for example, having a headquarters in an African country. And then you'll also provide, then there's also ability for, if you're looking for investment from the UK as well, to get advice on investment as well as trade. I thought it might be helpful just to provide a few examples of the businesses supported in South Africa already through this Growth Gateway. And this is a zoomed in version of one of the flyers on the previous slide that I'll share after the call, that shows you how to apply for the tailored support and how to immediately access all the guides that are already available online. As you can see here, we've got some wonderful South African exporters of various products being supported by Growth Gateway to date. In the interests of time, I won't go through them in further detail, but I'll instead finish with the final slide of my presentation, which sets out some of the key links for the information that I've talked through today, and provides step-by-step guides for how to export goods to the UK. And make sure, please, that you send me any questions if we don't have time to cover them today. Really welcome your feedback, and thank you again for the opportunity to present to you today. Back to you, Leela. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ms. Stotesbury, for your comprehensive and enlightening presentation on the SACU+M agreement and its benefits. Your insights into how this agreement facilitates trade and offers opportunities for South African SMMEs are invaluable. Your contribution has provided us with a deeper understanding of the trade landscape and how our SMMEs can leverage these opportunities for growth and success. It is now my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Ms. Rebecca Khaya, the Senior Regulatory Affairs Advisor at Ashbury Global. Ms. Khaya will be presenting on the essential requirements for food labeling compliance in the UK market. Her insights will be invaluable for SMMEs looking to ensure their products meet UK standards. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Kaya. Over to you, ma'am.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Natasha. That was absolutely it was for us nerds on customs riveting, and it was really, really great information. You've really got some fantastic support, it seems, in South Africa. So welcome, everybody. I'm going to be talking to you about the requirements for food products being exported into the United Kingdom. So I hope that's what you've come to listen to, because that's what we'll be doing. I'm just going to turn my little laser pointer on as well. Okay. Well, today we'll only really be able to do a lightning tour of the regulatory framework as it affects food products, because it's a complicated area and there's lots of diversity between South Africa requirements and those of the United Kingdom. And to some extent, we can touch on the requirements for the EU as well. So this is what we'll be looking at today and covering. I do hope that we will have some time to really do an in-depth Q&A session for those nuanced questions that you're bound to have. Let's start off by just introducing ourselves a little bit. I'm from Ashbury Global, sometimes called Ashbury Labelling, but basically we are a compliance company, and this is our coverage. We cover over 80 markets, many, many languages. So we are truly a global concern, and we really do look at products from their very inception, the formulation of foods, right through to the labelling and what you need to do to place on the market compliantly. A little bit more about us. I thought I really did need to outline what it says down the bottom there. So we act for very big clients like Marks and Spencer's, Aldi, Waitrose, etc. So we manage their compliance for their products. And to date, it's 200,000 or more products that we've sent into the market without encountering any issues at all. And we will look to why compliance is important to get right from the start, especially when you're consigning your goods from such a long distance away into the markets of Europe and the United Kingdom. Natasha's introduced trade very well. It seems as a lot of you have really got great insights into the machinations of free trade agreements, etc., country of origin, rules of origin. But there are a number of other impacts on trade which we find all the time. The kind of soft things that affect trade, cultural, the physical logistics, of course, economics, and the regulatory barriers that you're going to encounter. They are different in different markets, as we will discover. And overcoming them should be really something you think about right from the beginning when you're formulating an idea about a product in your mind. Let's go straight into food labelling and what it looks like. What's the regime? What are the regulations that cover packaged food being consigned into the United Kingdom? We need to look at a little bit of background first, so let's have a look. Just a note on this, and I know that you'll all understand that the United Kingdom has left the European Union, but it has created some difficulties when it comes to food labelling. You will know that Northern Ireland, which is that small territory up here, is part of the island of Ireland, and Ireland remains part of the European Union, which is these blue countries here. Now, when you're exporting into the United Kingdom, we have to say exporting into Great Britain, because there are now two different things. We have Great Britain, which consists of Wales, Scotland, and England, and then the United Kingdom, which includes Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland does have to follow the rules as far as packaged goods go, cosmetics, foods, all those household products must follow the rules that the EU has currently got. It does not follow the Great British rules. So just something to note as a result of Brexit. Why do we label food? I'm sure you know, but we've encapsulated it at Ashbury into the 3 A's. We need to advise the consumer what the product is, to really give them clear, accurate information as to what your product is, what it contains. We also need to alert the consumer to anything within that food or product that may be harmful, that may be something that's not suitable for them. In thinking about that, what I mean is things like halal diets, maybe kosher diets, allergens, etc. We need to alert the consumer, but there's a tension there. We also need to attract the consumer. We need to shout about the USP of our product, our food, and we really need to make it desirable to the consumer. And there's a tension there, of course, because that information needs to be prominent, but also the mandatory information which advises and alerts must also be prominent on food packaging and labelling. Why do we need to get it right? I said before, do think about the labelling and the compliance right from the beginning of when you're thinking about exporting your product or even developing your product, because the costs can be immense. These costs, of course, you're an exporter from South Africa, may be the liability may fall on your importer as well. So that's something when you look at your requirements for exporting and the trade agreements, you need to think about. But it can be extremely expensive. And worst of all, probably, is the one at the bottom. It's the reputational damage. If something goes wrong, if somebody gets hurt as a result of ingesting an allergen, or you need to recall a product, it just can be extremely damaging, way beyond the possible fines that you might get from a prosecution. What's the regime? There's quite a lot there. Don't mean to scare you with this, and I will make the links available in the chat very shortly. In the interest of making it look reasonably tidy, we haven't put the links directly in the slide, but I'll make those available. So the UK food labelling legislation and the other aspects around that, which cover the export of food, the hygiene of food, and what you need to put on it in terms of making a consumer aware of the nominal quantities, are all listed there. The major one, when you are thinking about what has to go on the labelling, is of course this one here. It's the Food Information Regulations. In the UK, they're the Food Information Regulations 2014. In the EU, they are the Food Information for Consumers Regulations. And don't worry, those links will be provided. At the bottom, this regulation is the one that will mean if you comply with this, you have a chance of getting your food over the border. As an exporter of food products which are covered by sanitary controls and phytosanitary controls, you will be subject to physical checks, documentary checks, etc. as your food comes into the United Kingdom. So compliance with this regulation is paramount. It's a complicated picture. When I'd say to exporters and people contemplating exporting or importing, the first thing I say is really understand who it is you need to get information from. There's a number of authorities, or I've just called them food law bodies, if you like, in the United Kingdom. They're going to be dealing with different aspects of your product, right through from the packaging at the front, the Environment Agency, right through to the Advertising Standards Agency, which is a watchdog, which will look at the information which you're providing about your food. You may have seen foods online saying that they're going to do the most wonderful things to your body, they're going to cure all sorts of things. Well, of course, that's covered by food law, and the Advertising Standards Agency will be watching. Where do you start? This is a fairly typical UK label, and I've really chosen it because I've got a sort of comparative South African product that we can look at. So I'll be using a reference to this one all the way through our slide deck. So we've got a product which is a beverage here, and it's from Tesco, which is a large UK retailer, of course. And the first thing you might notice is it looks a little bit different from South African labelling, and we will go through, just tease out some of those differences. These are listed here on the left-hand side, all the mandatory requirements that are going to have to go onto your food label. The name of the food, that's a difficult thing. We have legal names of food which must be given. If a food is a particular thing, like a beef burger, in the United Kingdom and the EU, it must come up to certain compositional standards. In other words, for a beef burger, it's got to contain 62% beef. The name of the food. And then we have the list of ingredients, including allergens. Now that's going to look a little bit different in the UK from South Africa. We'll go into that in a minute. An indication of ingredients and how much of that ingredient is in there, but only where that's applicable. An indication of the net quantity, that's down there. A durability indication, storage conditions where they need to be given to use the food safely, the name and address of the food business operator. Now, this could be tricky. Excuse me. If you're importing into the United Kingdom, what you'll need is a GB importer who is established in Great Britain, and it is their address that will need to be on the food packaging. Instructions, of course, where they're needed. Nutritional declaration we go into in some depth. Country of origin, and I did put a comment in the chat there in relation to rules of origin. They are one in the same thing, and they are applicable to food, of course. Alcoholic strength, of course, where applicable. Now, with alcohol, because I did notice we have a number of perhaps wine producers here, or at least one, there are some differences, just to note straight off, between the EU's current requirements for wines and alcohol products and GB. Let's go on. Languages. The first thing is to make sure that the food information you give is clear and accurate, and that's got to be given in the language of the country that you are sending it to. In United Kingdom, at the moment, that is just English. In the EU member states, that's different depending on which member state you are targeting. In South Africa, you've got many, many languages, but as I understand it, your food labelling is usually in English. In the United Kingdom, as we said, we've got English. Welsh is probably a language that will come to have some statutory protection and maybe something you need to think about using. But let's have a look at these examples of allergens. So in South Africa, we've got these listed as what we call the statutory or mandatory allergens that must be identified to a consumer. And you can see there are some differences between what we have in the United Kingdom, and that is inherited from the European Union. So these allergens are also the same as what we currently have in the EU. Some differences there, as you can see. And that's very important to note, probably the prime importance, because identifying allergens correctly makes sure the food is safe for everybody. Product titles and food name translations don't always work. When thinking about translating your food label, perhaps if you do have it in another language, it's important to note that translations, if they're simple translations, maybe just use Google Translate, or you're thinking about using the same food name, they don't always work. So some examples there that didn't really translate well from some products across the world. Said food names are complicated, and they do tax us an awful lot as advisors here at Ashbury. So let's have a little look at these South African products that I picked out from SPAR. First thing to note is we've got on the left-hand side, we've got almond milk. The term milk is protected in the UK and in the EU. You cannot use milk for anything that's not actually from a mammal. So almond milk is a term you can't use. You'd have to use almond drink. Another thing to note is this, I've just alluded to it with beef burgers, is compositional standards. In order to be able to use the term milk chocolate in the GB or in the EU, indeed, you'll have to make sure that the term milk chocolate complies with a standard of composition in terms of milk fats, milk solids, cocoa solids, etc. And there are some labelling requirements that come along with using this term milk chocolate. Let's have a little look at a South African product, and here I pulled out a beverage a bit similar to the one we saw earlier in our bright pink Tesco's label. So just have a look at that and you can immediately probably see some of the differences. And in looking at this one, what I will say is straight off, we don't have in this panel here, which comprises the information at the back of this bottle, anything like a descriptive name of the food. That's one of the major differences that I can see. Another difference is the indication of this food additive here. I'll look closely in the next slide at that. Another difference straight off is perhaps this one here. We've got sodium listed. Of course, that's not the same as the listing in a nutrition table in the EU or in the GB. Hopefully this is a familiar product to you. It looks like yummy. So let's look at that comparison here. Bearing in mind the label we've just seen before, here are the differences. The nutrition table is set out here in the format which is required, which we do delve into in a minute. But salt is the replacement in the UK label and the EU label for sodium. The structure's a little bit different here too. Now, what you can see too is an indication of that food business operator that we talked about. We've got some front of pack nutrition labelling. That's voluntary at the moment, but things change and it may become mandatory. Here we have the all-important name of the food. Now, this is a descriptive name, which is an absolute requirement in the UK to describe the food. And that way we format that is very particular, and there are a lot of mandatory requirements. Here's our product here, which is a food additive. So thinking of our citric acid, that was probably in there as an acidity regulator. Now, in the GB and in the EU, you'll have to identify what that food additive is doing in the food. Some storage instructions, as we said, and here a nice clear indication of the nominal quantity. And those rules are in the weights and measures packaged good regulations to how that has to appear on the label. What do we do with online selling? It's a massive part of selling and marketing your food. Just to understand really that any information you give relating to a food product, here it's some sausages in a packet, any information you give, even if it's not on the actual product packaging, is still food information, and it's still covered by those regulations you'll see later and we mentioned before. So here is an example of what we'd expect to see, what are mandatory requirements for food information presented on an online platform. As you can see, it's fairly complete. Now, all the mandatory information must reach the consumer, and by that we mean not we need the end consumer, but we also mean those business-to-business transactions, which are slightly different, must be there when that food arrives with that consumer. Some basic principles. Here's what it's got to look like. These are the codified provisions that we see within the regulations. We cannot and must not state that a food prevents or cures any human disease. That's called a medicinal claim. And we will see, and I'm sure you see too, a lot of foods out there making claims. And they may be doing it on their website and not on their packaging, but do remember those claims also count as food information. We can see some mandatory requirements for the sizing of letters that are within the food regulations for any food information which goes onto a packet. Food information must be clear, of course, and consumers must be easily able to understand it. And that could be down to thinking about aspects such as the colour of your background, what type fonts you're using, etc. We see some examples where it all looks good on a flat layout, and then when it's applied to a product can or package, it may become very unclear to a consumer. So do think about those things up front. The nutritional labelling, again, this is where we saw that on our cream soda product. So that format is specified by law. We go into it in a second. Some of it is optional, which I'll describe in a minute. But the first thing to remember with the nutrition information is it can't be presented in anything but that tabulated form, as we see there in a table. It must be, the first thing you do is present it like that, not in any other format. There is an example where you can do that, but all the other information will have to sort of go by the wayside before you do that with a nutritional labelling. This is what it looks like in depth. Excuse me. The header, what you call a nutritional table or nutritional information, isn't prescribed. You must include the term nutrition really, but there are a number of different ways you could present it. And this really just describes all that we have and must see on a nutrition label. As you can see, salt down there. There are prescriptions for the way in which these are presented. Of course, if you're using a mass to describe it, you use grams. If you're using volume indications, it is, of course, litres and millilitres. This information on kilocalories and kilojoules must be presented together. And this per serving where it's relevant. You don't have to do that. The mandatory information is per 100 grams, but there are lots of nuances to that, and it's quite complicated. If you have reference intakes for anything, reference intakes relate to this level there, this input, reference intake of an average adult. So that's set in law as being this amount for an average adult weighing about 70 kilograms. There is nothing in terms of children, by the way, at the moment. So the presentation of that as it appears, if you do wish to put that onto your food labelling. And I'll leave that in the interest of time for your reference. Additives. We talked about additives. We talked about our citric acid in our South African product and how that might appear as an acidity regulator in the ingredients list here. There are 14 food additives in the EU and in the GB, and they have to be identified in a food ingredients list by their category and the function that they have in the food. So there they all are for you. Some of these we don't see very often at all, but these must be identified by this function and also the name or the E number. So additives are all approved or unapproved additives in the GB and in the EU. It must be approved in order to be used. So you must know which ones are approved and not approved. Allergens, we saw that there was a difference in the list between what's an allergen or an allergenic food or food component in South Africa and in the GB and EU. Here is where we need to be utterly sure that we are following the rules to make sure the food's safe. Standard way of identifying or highlighting, which is the requirement, an allergen to a consumer is this way. It's really to embolden it within the ingredients list. And just some examples of how it's done here. It must be emboldened or highlighted to the consumer every time it appears in the ingredients list. This statement at the bottom is not actually a mandatory statement. However, it is needed for food safety purposes, of course, and they must be based on a HACCP assessment in your production of whether there's any risk of these components cross-contaminating the food at all. Some additional mandatory information which sometimes does get left off but is absolutely vital to packaged goods, especially foods. We will look at durability indications in the next slide. However, you do need to be able to identify a lot of production of a food, a production group. If you have a best before date or a best before end date that you're using, and that can't really identify a batch of production that's no longer than 24 hours, then you will need to pay attention to the locked marking regulations. And an example there is how that must appear on a package. You can see that they're using a best before end here, February 2005, a little bit old now, but that wouldn't identify a batch of production of that particular product. So additionally, the lot mark is presented here in a format which is prescribed using the L there, and a standard methodology of making sure that that production run can be identified. The nominal quantity we did mention. So there are prescribed ways in which and sizes of which this must appear. You'll see that we're using the metric system still in GB. There have been some pressures to use the imperial system of measures as well. Imperials can appear on the package too, actually, but they mustn't be more predominant or appear before the metric, which is the grams and litres, of course. So the height of these will be prescribed in the legislation, and this use, which is the average weight mark, which acts as a passport to say that you've complied with the average weights requirements, must be no less than 3 millimeters high when it appears on a package. Name and address of food business operator, a complex one. And when Brexit happened, it did give us a lot of work in people really trying to iron out what the requirements were. Just to state that you as South African businesses wishing to import into GB or the EU will need to find an importer, and it's that importer's details which must appear on the label. They can appear additionally, but they must be on the label of your food. And just an example here. Now, you can use several food business operator addresses. Let's say you wish to send your food into the EU and into GB2. You will need an EU food business operator address, an importer's address, and you will also need a food business operator address who's your importer into GB as well. So you can have multiple addresses. That isn't an issue. And in terms of cosmetics, that also is interesting. I can see a couple of cosmetics questions coming up there. Durability. There are several ways you can talk about durability on your food. Major one is use by date. Just to note that the landscape's changing. So a use by really in GB by law still means that a food sold beyond its use by date, if a consumer can pick it up from a retailer and purchase it, means that they have purchased unsafe food. It's just a strict liability. It's a cut-off. Beyond that, there's no point trying to prove that the food was safe. It is deemed in law unsafe beyond that date if you can be purchased. Slightly different to that, of course, is a best before and best before end date. They must be, there are prescribed ways in which that appears. That's laid out in the food information regulations as to what format that looks like. Just a little example down here. If you've got a multi-pack of foods, we've got some yogurts here in break apartable sort of pots, and you can see that durability information must appear on each individual item. Very important, of course, to ensure that each product that's packaged does have that, with some exceptions for some foods. For alcohol, for example, that is over 10% by volume of alcohol does not need a durability indication. Very important to ensure, however, that that is available to a consumer when consuming a food, to ensure that they consume it safely. Marketing claims, the world's full of them. However, they are governed. We mentioned the ASA, which is the Advertising Standards Authority in the UK, very active in ensuring that things are not said about foods which are untrue or cannot be verified. There's some guidance there and a link to the document and the best practice guidance, which we are following at the moment in GB in relation to some of these terms. So just a note really that those terms are protected. They are subject to some requirements if you do choose to use them, and some interpretations. They can be found here. Health claims. Food is medicine. I hear that said all the time, and we do want to shout out about the good things that our food can do. However, anything you say about a food in relation to what it can do for a person's health must be an approved health claim. There are two lists, one for the EU and one for GB, but they are fundamentally at the moment pretty much the same. Now, let's take you through this one. Over here, we've got some essential porridge oats, and we've got a generic health claim that they're good health. So Waitrose have put this on the front of their package now. In order to be able to do that, they have to use the text of an approved health claim, as well as being able to say this because there is an approved nutrition claim here. They are stating that it's high in fibre. So indeed, it must come up to the level to be described as a high in fibre food in order to be able to say this. The generic health claim here, it's good health, relates to an authorised specific health claim, which is listed on a GB list of authorised health claims. And that relates to the component of the porridge, which is the beta-glucan content. And you can tell that it's an approved one because it's got this great big weighty text to it that you have to use. So not only must you ensure that your product is adhering to these standards, you must also use a set of text in order to be able to make these claims. This generic claim, the specific one relating to beta-glucans, and this high fibre nutrition claim. All very complicated, but we can help you with that. Never forgetting the waste packaging. This is increasingly important in a world where sustainability must be on everyone's lips. It must be on the thought of making any product, really. We've got regimes coming into play which relate to deposit return schemes, which you can see outlined there on the right-hand side. So this means that if you're selling a beverage in a plastic container or an aluminium can, perhaps, you may need to think about labelling for a deposit return scheme as well. So your product goes into the market in the GB, or in the EU, we now have some mandatory deposit return schemes in different countries. You may need to think about labelling the product so that the consumer can recoup money back for returning that packaging. This is part of a regime to control waste packaging in foods and other products, which is coming on stream all over the world, really. So a complicated area. In the United Kingdom at the moment, we do use these labels. These are called the on-pack recycling labels. You can sign up to be able to use these labels. They're privately owned at the moment, but very soon we're expecting some mandatory requirements for the use of these labels. We do see now as well some differences where you've got multi-country labelling, and we'll have some indications that that is only for the UK. For example, if you're selling into the French market, there are enhanced requirements for waste packaging labelling, and that will identify it as only applicable to France. Some key takeaways before we go on to some questions, I do hope. Do make sure that your formulation, your recipe is compliant, that you are able to use those ingredients which you want to use in your food before you even sort of think about exporting. There are requirements which I've not been able to go into today about the ingredients, whether they might be a novel food. So are they a food which is not consumed in the GB or EU regularly? Has it not been consumed? It's not a history of consumption from 1997 onwards. It may be a food which is regularly consumed in Africa, but you may have to think about whether that ingredient is permitted or whether it is a novel food. So never assume a direct translation is going to be acceptable. It isn't. There are what we call regulatory translations required because the diversity of interpretation of what the legislation requires, and indeed some very specific regulations in different countries, that diversity. Ensure your claims can be verified and they can be evidenced before you even think to make them. Obviously, we do want to think about attracting the consumer, but let's make sure that those claims can be made. Get good advice right from the start. Consider how the colours, words, graphics work together, goes without saying, so that your information is clear and you're not inadvertently making a claim perhaps about where that food is from. Have you used a flag inappropriately that might mean that it looks as if the food is from there, but it isn't? Look at each product label and recipe separately on a case-by-case basis, we always have to say, because a food label in terms of compliance must always be regarded in its entirety, what it looks like to the consumer on the shelf, right down, in fact, to where it's placed in a retailer's premises. Well, I hope that does help you a little bit. I hope that leaves you with a resource that you can use to really answer more of your in-depth question, but that does leave us, I hope, Laia, with some time to answer directly some questions from our audience. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. A heartfelt thank you. And you've seriously given a very detailed and informative presentation on food labeling compliance for the UK market. and we appreciate the clear guidance that you provided on navigating these regulations. Your insights have given our SMMEs a thorough understanding of the necessary steps to ensure their products are compliant and ready for the UK market. This information is crucial for their success and competitiveness on the international stage. We will open the floor for questions. Please feel free to engage with our speakers and seek clarity on any aspects discussed today. You can please put your question in the chat box due to time constraint, and I will definitely be reading them out. Okay, there's a question here on shrink wrap labeling. Is there any thoughts on that, Rebecca?
Yes, a complex area. So shrink wrapping would, we need to consider whether the product inside can be viewed by the consumer. So if a consumer, in terms of what you need to put on the shrink wrap, is it completely encompassing the food? Is it tying together a multi-pack of food? So a bit like our yogurts or our drinks all collated together with a shrink wrap. In terms of whether information needs to go on that shrink wrap or not, and I'm talking about consumer-facing labelling here, it would thoroughly depend on whether the product can be seen through the shrink wrap and whether it completely encompasses that food. So you'll know your sort of a 6-pack of Coke cans, maybe you've got a wrap around them which doesn't actually completely cover them. So that changes the nature of what's required on that labelling. But in terms of shrink wrapping, if you're thinking about transit packaging, maybe you've got shrink wrap around a consignment of goods that's going on a pallet, that's again slightly different. In terms of what needs to be on that, we'd look at that in terms of how importing requirements are affected to go through that border control post, etc.
Okay, and I see that she's just added on the shrink sleeves on bottles.
Yeah, right. So I think if you're thinking about a bottle and you've got a sleeve, I think I've got one right here, actually. It's quite similar. So this is a bottle, and you've got your round wrapped on label. It's just a glass bottle there. That is a food label. We'd have to look at how that's presented to the consumer in terms of there are lots of aspects to consider. Where is the front piece of it? Where's the primary face? Where's the principal face? How's it going to look like what's it going to look like on the shelf to a consumer? So it's a very nuanced thing. I can't necessarily tease out so much, but yes, we look forward to seeing your product and then seeing how we can advise you.
Okay. The additives example on slide 23 that you presented on is similar to cosmetic products. So should the cosmetic products follow the same structural layout on a label?
No, I'll just pop that back up. So those additives, food products are separate. So the cosmetics regulations are separate as well. And although we do cover cosmetics, they're completely different. Completely different suite of regulations. I know that in looking, I did see someone that's dealing with a chamomile oil. Now, presumably, you could think that may be used in a cosmetic as well as a food ingredient, perhaps. There are some crossovers. However, cosmetic labelling is completely different and a completely different set of regulations. But I can put that into the chat if you'd like me to. I'll bring up the cosmetic regs and pop it in.
And also the dog food, the pet supplements, I'm assuming that also is a separate one.
Pet
Rebecca,
food labelling, yes.
Yes, I think rather than putting it in the chat box, when you send me this presentation, please send it to me via email so that when I send the presentation and the recording, then I will put everything in one email so they don't lose any of the information.
Perfect, Lia. Thank you.
All right. Next question is, do plastic lids on plastic bottles now need to be attached to the bottle itself for all products?
Yep, so that's the tethering requirements for beverage bottles, etc. That's a requirement for the EU. And bearing in mind that the requirement does apply to Northern Ireland as well, because it must follow EU regulations, although it's part of the United Kingdom. What we see now is the voluntary addition of that, because it will happen in GB. So producers are already ensuring that the tethering is something that they do for products that are going onto the GB market, but it is now a requirement under the EU regulations, enhanced producer responsibilities and other waste regulations. And what I'll do, Laia, is also add those links to those rather complicated waste packaging regs. I'll add them to the email.
Are there any inputs that you would like to give regarding cannabis-infused food like chocolates and cappuccino?
Yes, good old CBD. I'll just pop through to my questions. Yes, indeed. CBD at the moment sits in a very complicated area. It is a novel food. It has not been approved for use as a novel food. However, the Food Standards Agency has set up a list of cannabis related CBD, so that's cannabidiol, I can't say it, cannabidiol products. It's very complicated chemistry, but it has given a list of products which, although they are not approved and therefore should not be legally used in food, are being permitted to be used. I would say and suggest that at this time, not to add it. It will not make the food compliant. It's a moving feast on CBD.
Thank you. You'll be saying, can people do like what you just said now if you add the food in?
Yeah.
Any guidelines on the size or height of the rest of the wording on the labels?
In terms of those height requirements, they are set out in that slide there. So it was 1.2 millimeters at least. Anything below that is sort of legally deemed to be illegible, if you like. And that must be considered in combination with your sort of background, colours, your food, your typeface as to whether it's legible. But that's prescribed in the regulation, so it's 1.2 millimeters. There are some derogations, aren't there always, for foods that are in very small packages. So we would take that as it comes to give advice on the size of the lettering.
Okay. And how does one access the GB food importers in the UK for partnership purposes?
That's a very good question. I would not be in the best position to do that. Probably Natasha is in a far better position to look at how to access those that are looking to expand their sort of portfolio of brands, etc., and looking to import from South Africa. And I can see Natasha there now.
Natasha, do you have any input on this?
Thanks so much, Rebecca, for the excellent and fascinating presentation. If I heard the question correctly, it was around how best to find potential UK buyers for your product. The resources that I mentioned briefly in my presentation, I'll share afterwards, provide links to a UK importer database, and then also the Growth Gateway platform that I provided as well before. So happy to share those afterwards, and then feel free to get in touch directly as well.
Thank you very much. Who do I contact with regards to 0.0% de-alcoholized non-alcoholic wine?
Right. Well, that would make it not an alcohol product under the regulations. So it will be a beverage, a non-alcoholic beverage. However, the regulations around wine and alcoholized wine and wine products is complicated. We can cover that indeed for requirements for the labelling of that. To note that an alcohol product is different in the EU as it is in GB. At the moment, a non-alcoholic product is, I'm going to get this wrong, 0.5% alcohol. Below that is a non-alcoholic product in the EU, but that is not the case in GB. It's somewhat different.
Okay. And chili condiments, are they worth pursuing in the UK market?
Chili condiments, indeed. I think that there is definitely a market for that. Condiments is quite a difficult market. There are a lot of there's a lot of competition, but that means that there's also a an opportunity, doesn't it, really? So I think particular things to look out for if you're looking at chili is definitely the requirements for high risk foods not of animal origin. There are some regulations that control products which are that they're subject to temporary controls and to some testing requirements because they carry certain risks like aflatoxin, and I know that chili is one of those, especially if it comes from the warmer climes and it's undergoing a sort of long transportation from where it is. So I would say that high risk foods not of animal origin legislation, I'll put that on my list to send to you, Laia, is something to watch out for that.
All right. And someone who's starting up bottled or canned food, is that something of opportunity to pursue?
Canned foods, indeed, bottled and canned. Yes, if you're thinking about, obviously you've got to know where the opportunities are there in the market. I would say that there is a real taste for foreign foods, should I say, for want of a better word, for exotic foods. Canned foods, I would say the market looks really bleak in terms of when I go to the shelves and I see what's available in terms of canned foods, there isn't a lot of choice. So yes, I would say pulses, etc. Canned foods that might be mixes of recipes, stews, etc. may be something to look at. Yeah. And the requirements for canned foods and bottled foods are going to be less in terms of sanitary controls because of they're already fairly sort of treated. And certainly in terms of sanitary risk, they're viewed less. What I'm really saying with that is if you're trying to export a product like biltong or a meat product, it's more difficult because of those controls, which you then go to look at animal health requirements and risks. So it's a less risky food. So actually canned and bottled foods may be something that's got some opportunity to it, yes.
I just want to raise some of the questions that were, in case we've missed them. Are all the ingredients going to be okay to use in products for the UK? Are there any products that are banned?
Yes.
For example, you talked about cannabis now, but any others?
Yeah. So novel foods added to my list. So there will be foods, especially when we're talking about traditional foods from a third country or foods which are sort of brand new, that they're not something that's got a history of being used as a food. They will not be permitted to be used in the GB or indeed the EU. There are lists of novel foods. When I say that, there are lists of foods which have been looked at and assessed as to whether they are indeed novel or not, and then their safety looked at, and then they go on a list of being approved. A statutory instrument is issued to allow that food to be used. It's a complicated, cumbersome mechanism. However, there will be some foods, I would say, when you're looking to formulate, I guess it goes back to the message of looking to formulate, think about straight off, can I use that ingredient? Yes, there will be things that are banned. There will be additives that are banned. Some processing aids in things like wine, etc., maybe not be able to be used. Depend very much on a case-by-case basis as to what you've got there. But we can provide the novel foods sort of registers, links for you. But essentially, if a food's been consumed regularly and there's a history of consumption after 1997 in either the GB or EU, then it won't be a novel food. But actually finding that out can be really taxing and difficult. When I say you could go to a competent authority to find out, you could essentially you could ask the FSA for an opinion, but you may have to wait an awful long time for a response because yes, they're perhaps not as forthcoming as they might be on that front.
There's an interesting question here. What about wooden products? Because I see that countries like New Zealand, for example, they do not allow the wooden frame. So what about wooden products, gift boxes, crates, plant boxes, wine holders? Is that permitted in the UK?
That's a great question. So that speaks to the new requirements for if you thinking about the EU, You'll be aware perhaps of the EU deforestation regulations. You'd have to comply with that. And then you've got the sanitary requirements for anything that's made out of wood that's a pallet. But don't worry, that doesn't apply to I believe it's only pallets which have a sanitary requirement in terms of they need to display that they've been sort of fumigated, if you like. So wooden products on the whole, you will have some regulations in the United Kingdom about timber products, which is a separate set of regulations for constructed products. So that looks at whether they are timber products which have been the result of deforestation. They are the set of regulations that we have in the GB about timber products. For small producers, the requirements and liabilities are quite low, as I understand it. It's not something that I've come prepared to be able to give a very good answer about. But the things that might be pertinent will be the EU deforestation regulations and then the timber product regulations in GB.
Okay, any restrictions on electrolyte powder that you can mix with water?
That's interesting. Lots of great questions, by the way, guys. Electrolyte powders. So electrolyte powder depends on how you present it. You've got the possibility to present that as just a food, or you have the possibility to present that as a food supplement. There are two sets of regulations, and food supplements regulations are complicated. They enhance what you've got to do, say, and how you've got to label something, what you've got to do with it. It depends on how you're going to present electrolytes. We do see quite a few of those coming on the market. It's a burgeoning market. It would depend entirely on how you present them, whether as a food supplement or just as a food.
All right. There's a question here regarding vegan. Is there any specific law regarding vegan?
Another great question. There is no statutory understanding of what vegan means, which is problematic because we do see foods labeled things like free from, etc. And a lot oftentimes that's confused with the term vegan. So no, there's no statutory controls around using the term vegan. However, there's case law regarding how things are presented as free from. For example, we have a case in the UK, very famous now and important case, by a lady called Celia Marsh. She was very allergic to milk proteins, a very severe allergy. She understood that a vegan product meant a free from product. There was cross-contamination with milk proteins in that product, and she sadly lost her life. So it's a moving feast when it comes to vegan and vegetarian as to what that understanding is, but no, vegan has no sort of statutory protection, if you like. Again, case by case.
There's a great question here regarding UK selling food to the UK via internet or online sales. Is that permitted? How do you control?
Yes, it's probably a great inroad to a market now. That does slightly change what you need to do and how you operate. If you're selling directly to a consumer, then the requirements are that the consumer is in fact the importer, if I'm not mistaken. Natasha will be themselves the importer, so they can use that food for their own good. It'll come in not subject to the same sort of border controls, if you like. The VAT is and any import duties. The nuances around that I'm not ready to answer that question directly now, but that's a very different thing from importing into GB and using an importer, very much so. So the consumer becomes that importer themselves for their own use.
Can I just ask a last question, because there's a lot of questions coming up. I'm going to put it onto a Word document and send it to you, Rebecca, so that you can just answer them. And Natasha, if there's anything relating to you also. But I just want to ask this last question because it's quite crucial, seeing that we've got a lot of indigenous products that are being used in South African food products and drinks. Are there any regulations regarding that?
Yes.
Is there any list to that?
Yes, so this is the novel foods regulations. Part of the novel foods regulations does speak of traditional foods, so foods used traditionally outside the EU or GB. They can be marketed. There's a list. You have to go through a sort of registration and approval process, but it doesn't mean you have to prove safety in the same way as a novel food application requires. A novel foods application can take 2-3 years. It can cost over £1 million. It's ridiculous. But the traditional foods route is available. It's much less onerous in terms of saying there's a history of use of this food traditionally in my country, in my area, and here's the evidence to that effect. Should you present that to the FSA, then the food can be used under that traditional foods route, which is a part of the novel foods regulation. So in coming back to LIA, I will provide a little bit more detail on that. What I would say is there's some case law recently which has gone to really, there's a great big African diaspora. I am quite sure that there will be a history of use of a lot of those traditional foods within the EU and GB. Is finding that, though they'll already be in there and they're already being used, I expect, by the African diaspora. So there's some case law recently which brought that to the fore, where the FSA were challenged. They said, no, there's no history of use of this as a food in GB. The court decided that there was, but it related to those, the diaspora using it. It didn't have to mean everybody, that it was everybody using this food. So that's a movable feast, but some more detail follow when I follow up with LIA.
Thank you so much. It's a lot of questions. If we've missed out on any of the questions, I will definitely be putting all those questions, collating them, and I'll send it out to Rebecca so that she can answer them. And then you can refer back at your own perusal, at your own time. So as we come to the end of our webinar, I want to take a moment to summarize the key points from today's presentations. We've learned about the significant opportunities that trade with the UK offers for South African SMMEs and the importance of understanding and complying with food labeling regulations to ensure market access and consumer trust. To all the SMMEs here today, remember that every great journey begins with a single step. Embrace the challenges, leverage the knowledge shared today, and be persistent in your pursuit of international trade. The UK market is full of potential, and with the right preparation and determination, you can achieve remarkable success. A heartfelt thank you to our esteemed speakers, Ms. Natasha Stortsbury and Ms. Rebecca Kaya, and not forgetting Mr. Edward Round for your support, for their valuable insights and time. Mr. Ambrose Makwale, thank you for your continued support. Thank you to all the partners and participants for your active engagement and excellent questions. We look forward to seeing your business thrive in the UK market. Have a wonderful day, and thank you once again for joining us, and best wishes to all SMMEs as you embark on your export ventures. Have a wonderful day ahead, a blessed long weekend, and happy Women's Day for tomorrow. Take care. God bless.
Thank you, and good luck to everybody.
Thank you very, very much.
Rebecca and Natasha, you guys were awesome. Thank you so much. I'll be in touch with you, eh?
Thank you.
Please,
Thank you so
I
much,
can't
Leela.
forget Edward.
That was fabulous. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
All right. But I think we need to have a meeting off key of this. There's just so much that we can partner with CEDA.
Yes.
I think we need to have a proper meeting after this.
Yes. Yes, indeed. Yeah. Yeah.